He was born in an empire that seemed unshakable, but died leaving behind a country that would never be the same. The story of Vladimir Lenin is not just about politics. It's about deep ruptures, armed revolutions, and ideas that set the world on fire. How did a young Russian lawyer become the leader of one of the most radical events of the 20th century? How did his thinking shape the Russian Revolution, overthrow centuries of monarchy, and lay the foundations of Soviet communism? Get ready to discover the full journey of the man who led the Bolshevik Party, confronted Tsar Nicholas II, commanded the Russian Civil War, and founded the Soviet Union. From a childhood in rural Russia to absolute power in Moscow. This is the story of a revolution that began in the mind of a single man. Born into a collapsing Tsarist empire, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov grew up in a world where repression and inequality shaped the fate of the masses. His youth was marked by a family tragedy that pushed him toward radical politics and early exile. Over the years, he became an obsessive thinker, a tireless agitator, and the architect of a revolution that would shake the 20th century. This is the story of Lenin's rise, from a childhood in the Russian countryside to leading a global revolution, a path filled with ruptures, persecutions, wars, and decisions that shaped millions of lives. Before becoming a myth, Lenin was a man, and this is his true journey. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born on April 22, 1870, in the city of Simbirsk, located on the banks of the Volga River in the Russian Empire. He was the son of Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, a respected school inspector, and Maria Alexandrovna Blank. Lenin grew up in an educated, disciplined, and politically aware household. His father, who had been granted nobility by the state, was a firm advocate of public education and imperial order. The Ulyanov family enjoyed a certain local prestige, which allowed Lenin and his siblings access to the best available education in the region. During childhood, Lenin was described as an exceptionally brilliant student with great discipline and an impressive memory. He mastered Latin and Greek, read classical authors, and excelled in scientific subjects. However, his youth was marked by an event that would change the course of his life, the execution of his older brother, Alexander Ulyanov, in 1887. Alexander was hanged for involvement in a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. The tragedy deeply shook the family and left permanent marks on Vladimir, who until then had been relatively distant from political activism. Alexander's death did not spark immediate revolt, but it planted a growing unease in Lenin. He began to study more intensely the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, immersing himself in the world of historical materialism, class struggle, and scientific socialism. Still a teenager, he started openly criticizing the Tsarist system and its power structures. This period was decisive in the birth of his political consciousness, which would later turn into revolutionary action. In 1887, the same year of his brother's execution, Lenin was admitted to Kazan University to study law. A few months later, he was expelled for participating in student protests against university authorities and the imperial regime. Even though he was formally removed from studies, Lenin continued to prepare on his own and later passed his exams, earning a law degree. During this time, he deepened his connection with underground Marxist circles and began to stand out as someone with great intellectual ability and sharp critical thinking. Family losses, Tsarist repression, and constant reading of Marxist works pushed him further toward radicalism. The first steps of this path will be taken soon, when he finally decided to actively enter revolutionary political militancy. The history of the Russian Revolution had not yet begun, but its chief architect was already preparing behind the scenes. As he matured politically, Lenin was already standing out among his peers as someone with great intellectual ability and sharp critical thinking. Family losses, Tsarist repression, and constant reading of Marxist works pushed him further toward radicalism. The first steps of this path would be taken soon, when he finally decided to actively enter revolutionary political militancy. The history of the Russian Revolution had not yet begun, but its chief architect was already preparing behind the scenes. After his studies independently, Lenin earned his law degree in 1891, which allowed him to work professionally in the city of Samara. Although he practiced law, his focus had already shifted to studying Marxism and engaging with revolutionary circles. In the following years, he delved deeply into the works of Marx and Engels, solidifying his critical view of the Tsarist system and the economic structure of the Russian Empire. During this phase, he began developing his own interpretation of historical materialism, which would later become known as Leninism. In 1893, Lenin moved to St. Petersburg, then the capital of the Russian Empire, and became more actively involved with underground Marxist groups. He quickly gained respect for his strategic intelligence and organizational skills. During this period, he drew closer to the group that would become the core of the future Bolshevik Party. Alongside other militants, he began coordinating the distribution of pamphlets, secret meetings, and theoretical discussions aimed at organizing the urban proletariat against the Tsarist regime. In 1895, Lenin founded the Union of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, an organization that combined revolutionary theory with practical action. The group aimed to strengthen the Soviets and build a solid foundation for the Russian Revolution, which he believed to be inevitable. That same year, Lenin was arrested by Tsarist police for involvement in subversive activities. He spent more than a year in pretrial detention and was later sentenced to internal exile in Siberia, where he remained from 1897 to 1900. During his exile in Siberia, Lenin maintained extensive correspondence with revolutionaries across Russia and abroad. He wrote several texts, including the book The Development of Capitalism in Russia, in which he analyzed the country's uneven industrialization and defended the need for a workers' revolution. In this period, he solidified his ideas on the dictatorship of the proletariat, arguing that only a worker's seizure of power could overthrow the bourgeois system and the Tsarist regime. Throughout his stay in Siberia, Lenin deepened his vision that a necessity for a centralized party, disciplined and led by professional revolutionaries. For him, the spontaneity of the masses was not enough to bring down the imperial regime. This conviction would directly influence the organizational structure of the Bolshevik Party, which he would help found shortly thereafter. It was also during exile that he officially adopted the pseudonym Lenin, used to avoid censorship and protect his identity. In 1800, after completing his sentence, Lenin left Siberia and traveled abroad. He first settled in Munich, then in London, and finally in Geneva, where he began a phase of intense political and editorial activity. In this new stage, he founded the newspaper Iskra, with the aim of unifying Russian socialists and promoting Marxism among the workers. The publication served as a tool to consolidate the ideological foundations of what would become the Bolshevik Party. The beginning of Lenin's active militancy was not only marked by arrests and repression, but also by the consolidation of his strategic vision for the revolution in 1917. He understood that transforming Russia required organizing the party as a vanguard force, capable of leading the people and establishing communism. This vision gained strength with each confrontation with the Tsarist regime, while the political landscape in Russia grew increasingly unstable. From that point on, Lenin would become one of the central figures in the Russian revolutionary movement, quickly moving to the center of the historical stage.
During the early years of the 20th century, Vladimir Lenin lived in several Western European countries, always involved in socialist militancy and the organization of revolutionary press. Between 1900 and 1903, he worked mainly in Switzerland, Germany, and England, where he maintained contact with important figures of the international workers' movement. During this period, the newspaper Iskra circulated more widely, becoming one of the main tools for ideological unification of Russian socialists in exile. In 1903, the Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party took place, first in Brussels and later in London. It was at this meeting that the split between two factions occurred: the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, and the Mensheviks, led by Julius Martov. The main disagreement centered on the concept of a party. Lenin defended a centralized organization made up of professional revolutionaries, while Martov believed in a broader or more democratic structure. From that point on, the name Bolshevik Party, from the Russian Bolshinstvo, meaning majority, became associated with Lenin's group. The foundation of the Bolshevik Party was a decisive milestone in Lenin's trajectory. Based on Marxist principles, he proposed a highly disciplined and hierarchical party capable of leading the working class toward the Russian Revolution. This vision contrasted with other European socialist currents at the time, which favored gradual reforms and parliamentary alliances. Lenin believed that only a complete break with the Tsarist system and the bourgeoisie would guarantee the establishment of communism. Over the following years, Lenin remained in constant movement across Europe, often under false identities to avoid police surveillance. During this period, he intensified his theoretical production and participated in several international meetings with militants from other countries. He sought to consolidate the foundations of Leninism, which differed from classical Marxism through its emphasis on the revolutionary vanguard and direct action as drivers of history. At the same time, he closely monitored the situation inside Russia, where popular dissatisfaction was rapidly growing. In 1905, the First Russian Revolution erupted, a wave of protests, strikes, and military mutinies that weakened the regime of Tsar Nicholas II. Lenin temporarily returned to Russia during this period, attempting to strengthen the Bolshevik Party and expand its influence within the Soviets. Although the revolution was eventually suppressed, it served as a strategic learning experience for Lenin, who realized the need to prepare the party for future opportunities to seize power. The experience also reinforced his distrust of the Mensheviks, whom he viewed as overly hesitant and conciliatory. With the defeat of the 1905 revolution, Lenin returned to exile and focused even more on internal party organization. He believed that victory required not only gaining mass support, but also ensuring that the Bolshevik Party had a solid structure, resistant to repression, and capable of acting decisively in critical moments. During this time, he developed rigorous methods of recruitment and training for militants, as well as clandestine financing strategies to sustain revolutionary activity. The definitive creation of the Bolshevik Party as an independent organization, fully separate from the Mensheviks, would solidify over the following decade. But already in the early years of the 20th century, Lenin had established the theoretical, practical, and organizational foundations of the movement that would soon lead the revolution in 1917. Even far from Russia, his name circulated among militants and intellectuals as the main architect of a new revolutionary strategy. And the growing instability in the country signaled that the historical opportunity could arise at any moment.
When World War I broke out in 1914, Vladimir Lenin was in Western Europe, closely following the conflict that involved the continent's major powers. Unlike many European socialist leaders who chose to support their respective countries during the war, Lenin openly condemned the conflict, labeling it an imperialistic dispute among national bourgeoisies. For him, the war represented a historic opportunity to turn the global crisis into a Russian revolution. As a result, he broke with several organizations of the Second International that had embraced wartime nationalism. Lenin began to advocate a new strategy, transforming the war between nations into a civil war within countries, especially in Russia. He believed that the suffering caused by the war would deepen popular dissatisfaction and create ideal conditions for overthrowing the Tsarist regime. This vision was laid out in texts like The Collapse of the Second International and Socialism in War, where he reinforced the idea that Russian workers should not fight for their homeland, but against their government. The revolution, in his view, should arise from the chaos brought on by the World War. In the early years of the conflict, Lenin remained exiled in Switzerland, where he led a small group of Bolshevik militants and maintained contact with revolutionaries from various countries. During this period, he developed his Zurich theses, deepening his analysis of imperialism, class struggle, and the need for a total rupture with bourgeois state structures. At the same time, he followed the developments on the battlefield and the severe social crisis spreading through Russia, marked by hunger, desertions, and economic collapse. In February 1917, popular pressure led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the collapse of the Russian Empire. A provisional government was established in Petrograd, led by liberals and moderate socialists. Lenin, still in Switzerland, received the news with enthusiasm, but also with caution. For him, the Russian Revolution was only beginning. The real objective, in his view, was to replace the provisional government with a government of the Soviets, the councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his journey. Lenin's return to Russia, however, posed both logistical and political challenges. Crossing enemy territory during wartime was considered treason, and he risked immediate arrest. Then a controversial solution emerged. With the support of Germany, Russia's enemy in the war, Lenin crossed German territory in a sealed train bound for Petrograd. The Germans hoped his arrival would further destabilize the Eastern Front. In April 1917, Lenin arrived in Russia under the watchful eyes of both allies and adversaries. Upon arrival, Lenin delivered his famous April Theses, a revolutionary document that rejected any support for the provisional government and called for immediate transfer of power to the Soviets. He reaffirmed Russia's withdrawal from the war, the distribution of land to peasants, workers' control over factories, and the nationalization of banks. His proposals shocked even members of the Bolshevik Party, but gradually gained traction as the provisional government failed to solve the country's urgent problems. Lenin's return to Russia marked a turning point in preparation for the October Revolution. His leadership was crucial in reorganizing the Bolshevik Party, expanding popular support, and establishing a clear strategic line. He began frequently addressing crowds calling for an immediate end to the war and the construction of a new socialist order. As the country's chaos deepened, Lenin's figure grew as the symbol of a radical alternative to the moderate transition model. The Russian Revolution was nearing its climax, and Lenin stood at the center of the storm. At the beginning of 1917, the Russian Empire was undergoing rapid internal collapse. Economic crisis, food shortages, and military defeats in World War I fueled widespread dissatisfaction among workers, peasants, and soldiers. In February, a strike in Petrograd quickly turned into a wave of mass demonstrations, with barricades in the streets and desertions in the army. Under growing pressure, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne on March 2, 1917, ending centuries of Romanov dynasty rule. With the abdication, a provisional government was formed, initially led by Georgy Lovov and later by Alexander Kerensky. This new leadership tried to stabilize the country by maintaining Russia's participation in the war and postponing deep social reforms. However, alongside the provisional government, the Soviets, popular councils formed by workers, peasants, and soldiers, were gaining strength and authority, creating a situation of dual power that challenged centralized authority. This environment allowed the Bolshevik Party to begin its rise. Lenin, newly arrived in Russia, refused any support for the provisional government. In his speeches and writings, he argued that this government represented the interests of the bourgeoisie and the landowners. He insisted that all power should be transferred to the Soviets, the only legitimate representatives of the people. The slogans "Peace, Land, and Bread" and "All Power to the Soviets" quickly spread among workers and soldiers, becoming symbols of the Bolshevik line. The Bolshevik Party began to grow rapidly, occupying key positions in the councils and expanding its support base. In the following months, the provisional government faced a series of political crises and popular revolts. Russia's continued participation in the war was deeply unpopular, and promised land reforms failed to materialize. Strikes and mutinies multiplied, as did clashes between government forces and protesters. Meanwhile, Lenin intensified his political activity, working within the Bolshevik Party to prepare for a new uprising, this time with the goal of seizing power definitively. During the summer of 1917, events such as the July Days unfolded, in which armed demonstrations filled the streets of Petrograd. The repression that followed forced Lenin to go into hiding temporarily in Finland, while other Bolshevik leaders were arrested. Even so, the popularity of the Bolsheviks continued to grow, especially among soldiers and urban workers. Lenin used this period to reorganize the party's strategy, strengthening its underground structure and preparing for a final offensive. As the provisional government lost support, the Bolsheviks gained strength in various Soviets across the country. In September, they secured a majority in the Petrograd Soviet, one of the most important in the nation. This advance was crucial to consolidating Lenin's position in the revolutionary movement. He began openly advocating that the time was right for an armed insurrection. In internal meetings, he insisted that delay in action would mean wasting a unique historical opportunity. The fall of the Tsar, the fragility of the provisional government, and the strengthening of the Soviets created a highly unstable environment ripe for the October Revolution. Lenin and the Bolshevik Party were preparing their next steps with precision, fully aware that control of Petrograd and its Soviet would be decisive. The stage was set for another turning point in Russian history, and this time, power would no longer be debated in words, but seized definitively by the revolutionaries. By late October 1917, the Bolshevik Party, under Vladimir Lenin's leadership, believed that the conditions were ripe for an uprising. With majority support in the Petrograd Soviet and growing mobilization among local soldiers, Lenin began pressuring his comrades to act. On October 24, November 6 in the Gregorian calendar, the Bolsheviks began occupying key points throughout the city, such as train stations, bridges, telegraph offices, and power plants. The operation was carried out in a coordinated manner and faced almost no resistance, thanks to popular support and the paralysis of the provisional government. In the early hours of October 25, November 7th, the Red Guards, workers' militias organized by the Bolsheviks, surrounded the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government. After a few hours, and with minimal resistance, the building was stormed. Alexander Kerensky, the government's leader, had already fled. With that, central power officially passed to the Petrograd Soviet, dominated by the Bolsheviks. Lenin was acclaimed as the leader of the new revolutionary government, marking the beginning of a new political era in Russia. In the first months, Soviet government faced enormous challenges. Besides pulling Russia out of the war, Lenin sought to consolidate power internally. He created the Cheka, the political police tasked with fighting counter-revolutionaries, suppressing conspiracies, and eliminating enemies of the new regime. Censorship was expanded, opposition newspapers were shut down, and rival parties lost the right to operate legally. The new government declared itself a dictatorship of the proletariat, justifying repressive measures as necessary to protect the gains of the Russian Revolution. Internationally, the October Revolution had a massive impact. Communist parties emerged in various countries, inspired by the Russian example. The founding of the Third International, or Comintern, was promoted by Lenin as a way to export socialist revolution worldwide. At the same time, Western nations observed the consolidation of Bolshevik power with concern, which soon led to sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and even support for counter-revolutionary forces within Russia. The October Revolution cemented Vladimir Lenin as the central figure in Russian politics and began a deep and irreversible transformation. Tsarist Russia had been definitively replaced by a new regime based on communism and led by the Bolshevik Party. The country would still face intense conflict in the coming years, but the regime change was now irreversible. Lenin was in power, and with him, a new chapter in Russian and world history had begun.
Right after the October Revolution, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party began implementing a series of radical transformations aimed at consolidating the new Soviet government. The first step was to formalize Russia's withdrawal from World War I. This decision materialized in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918 between Russia and the Central Powers, especially Germany. The treaty imposed harsh territorial losses on Russia, including the cessation of regions such as Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states. But Lenin considered it necessary to keep focus on the Russian Revolution and prevent internal collapse. At the same time, the new government began nationalizing banks, industries, and transportation. Private companies were expropriated and placed under workers' control or directly managed by the state. The land reform, established by the Decree on Land, was put into action through the redistribution of large estates to peasants. These actions aimed to dismantle the economic structure of the old regime and build the foundations of a socialist economy. The impact was immediate. While part of the population welcomed the changes, former landowners and conservative sectors began organizing against the new power. One of the most emblematic measures at the start of Lenin's government was the creation of the Cheka in December 1917. The Cheka, short for Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, had the primary function of identifying, arresting, and eliminating threats to the Bolshevik regime. With broad powers, it operated without the need for formal trials and was authorized to carry out summary executions. The Cheka quickly became a central instrument in maintaining state control, feared for its severe methods of repression. Its role would intensify in the following years, especially during the Russian Civil War. Beyond internal repression, Lenin also worked to consolidate the new regime through the centralization of power. Local Soviets were subordinated to the directives of the Bolshevik Party's Central Committee. Freedom of the press was drastically reduced, with opposition newspapers shut down and strict control over permitted publications. Political parties not aligned with the Bolsheviks were banned, and opponents began to be systematically persecuted. For Lenin, these measures were not authoritarian, but rather a necessary stage of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as prescribed by his interpretation of Marxism. Another significant move was the transfer of the capital from Petrograd to Moscow, carried out in March 1918. The decision had both practical and symbolic reasons. Petrograd, located near the border and constantly under threat, was militarily vulnerable. Moscow, in the interior, offered more security and held symbolic value as the historical center of Russian power. The new capital became home to the main institutions of the Soviet government, consolidating the power center around the Bolshevik Party. In the economic field, Lenin implemented the policy known as war communism, aimed at addressing shortages and ensuring supplies for the Red Army. Food production and distribution was centralized, private trade was banned, and the economy came under direct state control. These measures generated resistance among peasants, who often refused to surrender their harvests, prompting the government to adopt forced requisitions.
Tension in the countryside increased, but Lenin believed that the temporary sacrifice was necessary to preserve the gains of the revolution. These early months after the October Revolution marked a new political, economic, and social order in Russia. The Bolshevik Party, under Lenin's direct leadership, consolidated its power through decrees, repression, institutional reorganization, and a definitive break with the Tsarist model. The country was transforming rapidly, but resistance was growing across various regions. Lenin knew that the Russian Revolution still faced enormous challenges, and that the real battle for the survival of the new regime was only beginning.
Shortly after the October Revolution and Russia's withdrawal from World War I, the country plunged into a new conflict, the Russian Civil War. On one side stood the Red Army, under Bolshevik command and led by Leon Trotsky. On the other, the counter-revolutionary forces known as the Whites, a heterogeneous alliance of former Tsarist officers, monarchists, Republicans, liberals, and moderate socialists. The conflict, which lasted from 1918 to 1921, became one of the most violent episodes in Russian history and a decisive test for the survival of Lenin's government. The White Army received foreign support from powers like the United Kingdom, France, Japan, and the United States, which feared the spread of communism and viewed the Russian Revolution with hostility. The Red Army, organized in a centralized and disciplined manner, used effective logistical strategies and controlled the country's main cities and railway hubs. Trotsky, appointed People's Commissar for Military Affairs, played a key role in the Bolsheviks' military organization and in defending the nascent Soviet Union. During the conflict, the Bolshevik government intensified its repressive policies, justifying them as necessary to defend the revolution. The Cheka drastically expanded its operations, targeting not only military enemies, but also political opponents, religious groups, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activity. This period became known as the Red Terror, marked by mass executions, arbitrary arrests, forced labor camps, and disappearances. The dictatorship of the proletariat, defended by Lenin as a necessary stage of the revolution, began to take on authoritarian and violent contours. The violence did not come solely from the Bolsheviks. The white forces also committed massacres, persecutions, and looting, especially against peasant populations and ethnic minorities. The Civil War caused widespread destruction, massive population displacement, and a collapse in agricultural production. Millions died in combat, from famine, disease, or reprisals. Amidst the chaos, Lenin remained determined to preserve revolutionary power and prevent any restoration of the old regime or the advance of bourgeois forces. To ensure the Bolshevik government's survival, war communism was maintained and deepened. The economy became even more centralized, state control expanded, and repression in the countryside intensified. Peasants who refused to surrender their harvests were harshly punished. Urban strikes were forcefully suppressed, and some segments of the working class who had supported the revolution began showing dissatisfaction with the regime's direction. Lenin, aware of the contradictions, viewed these actions as part of the revolutionary process. At the height of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks faced armed uprisings in several regions of the country, such as the Kronstadt Rebellion in 1921, led by sailors who had once been allies of the 1917 revolution. These events revealed that support for the new government was not unanimous, even among former allies. Still, the Red Army managed to crush these rebellions, regain control of threatened territories, and preserve the integrity of the Soviet project. By 1921, after 3 years of brutal conflict, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious. The White Army was defeated, its leaders killed, exiled, or imprisoned, and foreign intervention withdrew as the new power consolidated. Victory in the Russian Civil War
marked a definitive milestone in Lenin's rise and the consolidation of the Soviet Union. However, the human and social cost was immense. The Russian Revolution had survived, but the country it left behind bore the deep scars of war and repression. Lenin now faced the challenge of rebuilding a devastated nation. With the Bolsheviks' victory in the Russian Civil War, Lenin began the process of restructuring the state based on communist principles. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was officially proclaimed. The new state was not simply a continuation of the old Russia under a different name, but a federation composed of various socialist republics, including Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia. The creation of the USSR was the formal step that consolidated the new regime, definitively replacing the former Russian Empire with a multinational socialist structure. Since the October Revolution, Lenin had advocated for the right of nations to self-determination. In his speeches and writings, he stated that peoples once dominated by the Russian Empire had the right to decide whether they wanted to remain united with Russia or form their own states. This policy aimed to gain the support of historically marginalized ethnic and national groups. However, in practice, most of the newly formed republics were reintegrated into the new union under the dominant leadership of the Russian Communist Party. The structure of the USSR was organized in a centralized manner, with power concentrated in Moscow. The Communist Party controlled all aspects of political, economic, and cultural life in the member republics. Each republic had its own constitution, flag, and local government, but followed directives imposed by the Soviet Central Committee. Lenin believed that this organization would allow cultural diversity to be respected without compromising the ideological unity of the socialist state. It was an attempt to reconcile Marxist internationalism with the national realities inherited from the Russian Empire. To ensure cohesion within the new union, Lenin authorized limited administrative autonomy for the republics while reinforcing the presence of Russian officials in local governments. The Russian language became the official language of administration and education, and the Bolshevik Party maintained a strong presence in all levels of power. The foundation of the USSR was celebrated as a historic milestone, not only within the country, but also by supporters of communism worldwide. It was seen as the first socialist state in history, and its emergence radically altered the political map of Europe and Asia. On the international stage, the creation of the Soviet Union drew mixed reactions. Some Western powers maintained diplomatic isolation toward the regime, while others began discreet contacts. Internally, the Soviet government launched campaigns to integrate the republics, aiming to consolidate a collective identity and a shared economic project. Large infrastructure projects such as railways, electrification, and industrial reorganization began to be planned as part of the effort to rebuild the country devastated by war. The founding of the USSR also marked the beginning of a new stage in Lenin's political path. Although he's still in power, his health was rapidly deteriorating, and debates over the future of Soviet leadership were growing behind the scenes of the party. The consolidation of the Union of Republics was seen as his last great political achievement. In this way, Lenin symbolically concluded his revolutionary work. From the fall of the Russian Empire to the creation of a new geopolitical entity built on the principles of communism and ruled by a single party. The Soviet Union was born as a political experiment unprecedented in the modern world, a direct result of Lenin's ideas and the transformations initiated in 1917. Its existence would profoundly reshape international politics throughout the 20th century. But while the new state was taking shape, Lenin was facing increasing physical limitations. The transition of power was approaching, and the future of the Soviet Union would soon depend on different hands.
After the Russian Civil War, Russia faced a deep economic crisis. The policy of war communism, implemented during the conflict, had led to the collapse of agricultural, industrial, and commercial production. Famine spread across cities. The black market dominated urban centers, and peasant uprisings multiplied. Even sectors of the working class, which had initially supported the Russian Revolution, began to show dissatisfaction with the direction of the Bolshevik regime. In response, Lenin decided to adopt a new economic approach. In March 1921, during the 10th Congress of the Communist Party, Lenin announced the new economic policy, known by the acronym NEP. The proposal called for a tactical retreat from full socialist control, allowing elements of market economy under strict state supervision. Peasants could sell part of their harvest freely, small businesses were permitted, and in-kind taxation was replaced by a fixed tax. Large industries and strategic sectors remained under state control, but the rest of the economy was granted more flexibility. The adoption of the NEP was not unanimously accepted within the Bolshevik Party. Many militants viewed the measure as a betrayal of communist principles. Lenin, however, defended the decision as a necessary step to rebuild the economy and ensure the revolution's survival. He described the retreat as one step backward to take two steps forward. The NEP was presented not as a renunciation of communism, but as a temporary adaptation to the extreme conditions left by war and international isolation. The initial results of the new economic policy were positive. Agricultural production began to rise again. Urban markets were restocked, and the circulation of goods resumed more regularly. Small entrepreneurs, nicknamed netmen, reappeared in the cities, revitalizing sectors like transportation, clothing, and food. Although the state retained control over core sectors like mining and energy, the population felt some relief after years of shortages and total control. At the same time, Lenin reinforced the need to keep political power firmly in the hands of the Communist Party. The NEP did not imply democratic openness or pluralism. Repression of opposition continued. The Cheka, now reorganized as the GPU, remained active, and elections in the Soviets stayed under Bolshevik control. Lenin believed that only a strong and centralized party could lead the country through the transition toward full socialism, even with temporary concessions to market economics. The NEP also aimed to restore confidence among the Soviet republics and stabilize the USSR as a long-term project. Lenin understood that a fully nationalized economy in a war-ravaged country was unsustainable. The new economic policy represented a pragmatic response to post-war reality. Despite internal criticism and external threats, the USSR showed gradual signs of recovery, and Lenin's leadership remained unquestioned in the revolutionary process. However, while the economy showed early signs of stabilization, Lenin's health was in steep decline. His ability to act directly was diminishing, but his ideas continued to guide the direction of the Soviet state. The NEP would be his last major political decision, marked by a delicate balance between ideology and necessity. The future of the USSR would now depend on whether his successors could sustain this fragile model or break away from it entirely. And that debate would soon intensify within the party. Beginning in 1922, Vladimir Lenin's health deteriorated rapidly. In May of that year, he suffered the first of a series of strokes that impaired his speech, mobility, and cognitive abilities. Although he attempted to remain politically active, his direct involvement in state affairs was gradually reduced. The impact of his illness was profound, especially for a leader who had concentrated so much power and control over the direction of the Russian Revolution and the newly formed Soviet Union. In the months following his first stroke, Lenin alternated between periods of partial recovery and relapses. Even weakened, he tried to continue writing and dictating documents, many of which were addressed to the Communist Party. His decline in health became a sensitive topic within political circles, and internal disputes intensified around the question of his succession. Lenin's presence was still central to Soviet politics, but the leadership vacuum created space for other party figures to begin maneuvering quietly to secure key positions. During this period, Lenin showed growing concern about the direction of the Bolshevik Party. He watched with unease the advance of bureaucratization and the excessive concentration of power in the hands of certain officials. In particular, he became increasingly worried about Joseph Stalin, who had been appointed General Secretary of the party in 1922. Lenin considered Stalin rude and authoritarian and expressed doubts about his ability to lead the party in a balanced manner. His criticisms of Stalin became more frequent in letters and personal notes. Despite his physical weakness, Lenin remained lucid in many moments. In several writings, he warned of the dangers of power concentration and called for greater collegiality in the decisions of the Central Committee. He also recommended caution in relations with the Soviet republics, proposing a more flexible federative model. Even though he could no longer participate actively in party meetings, his observations influenced internal debates. However, his voice no longer carried the uncontested authority it once held. In December 1922, Lenin suffered a second, more severe stroke that further limited his ability to communicate. He withdrew completely from public life and began living in seclusion in Gorky, a residence near Moscow. During this period, he remained under constant medical care and in contact only with a few close collaborators. The party continued governing, but Lenin no longer took part in crucial decisions. His absence was deeply felt, and internal disputes grew sharper. Behind the scenes, Joseph Stalin consolidated his position, controlling the administrative mechanisms of the party and forming strategic alliances. Lenin's absence allowed Stalin to expand his influence over other members of the Central Committee. Meanwhile, figures such as Leon Trotsky, Lev Kamayev, and Grigory Zinoviev competed for leadership roles in the future direction of the country. The balance of power was unstable, and Lenin's succession became the main point of tension within the Soviet elite. By the end of 1923, Lenin was fully incapacitated. His weakened body and difficulty communicating prevented any return to political activity. Even so, his image continued to be revealed by millions of Soviet citizens as the architect of the Russian Revolution and the founder of the USSR. The country continued to transform, but Lenin, once the most active and central figure of the entire revolutionary process, now watched everything from a distance, silent, isolated, and aware that his final days were approaching. During the final months of his life, already removed from the active leadership of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin devoted himself to writing a series of notes and letters that became known as his political testament. These documents, written between December 1922 and January 1923, were primarily intended to guide the future of the Communist Party and prevent internal disputes that could threaten the continuity of the revolutionary project. With his health increasingly deteriorated, Lenin used the little time and energy he had left to leave his final instructions to the Bolshevik leadership. At the center of the testament, Lenin expressed deep concern about the growing bureaucracy within the Soviet state. In his view, the party was at risk of becoming a rigid structure, detached from the masses and dominated by officials who had distanced themselves from the working class base.
Lenin saw bureaucratization as a real threat to the vitality of the Russian Revolution and the legitimacy of Soviet power. He proposed measures to expand internal party democracy and strengthen collective control over decision-making. One of the most well-known sections of the Testament referred to Joseph Stalin. Lenin warned about the authoritarian behavior of the General Secretary and recommended that he be removed from the position. He described Stalin as rude, impatient, and dangerous in his interactions with comrades. Lenin also criticized incidents in which Stalin had mistreated Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya. For Lenin, such behavior was incompatible with the role of the party's top leadership. Although he did not name a direct successor, he made it clear that he saw Stalin as a risky choice for the future of the USSR. The Testament also mentioned other prominent leaders, such as Leon Trotsky, whom Lenin recognized as the most intellectually capable, although he also pointed out issues related to character and temperament. He also discussed Kamenev, Genoviev, and Bukharin, analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of each. The goal was not to appoint a new leader, but to warn against excessive centralization and internal power struggles. Lenin insisted on the need for collective and balanced leadership based on mutual trust and transparency. After Lenin's death, the Testament was discussed within the party, but was ultimately kept secret by the top Bolshevik leadership. Stalin, already consolidating his dominant position behind the scenes, acted directly to minimize the document's impact. With the support of allies like Genoviev and Kamenev, he blocked the broader dissemination of its contents and ensured his continuation as General Secretary. This episode would become a milestone in the internal disputes that shaped the future of the USSR in the years that followed. Despite being silenced, Lenin's testament remained an important reference for critical factions within the party throughout the 1920s. Many of Stalin's opponents, such as Trotsky and his followers, cited the document as proof that the very founder of the Russian Revolution had foreseen the danger of authoritarian rise. However, in practice, the contents were ignored, and Lenin's warnings were not acted on by the majority of Soviet leaders. These final words from Lenin reflected his concern not only with the structure of the party, but with the fate of the entire socialist project. No longer able to intervene directly, he sought to influence the future with the only tool he had left, the written word. The Testament did not prevent the coming conflicts, but it clearly documented the tensions already growing within the Soviet regime. It was Lenin's last effort to preserve the original spirit of the Russian Revolution amid the profound changes that were already looming. As Vladimir Lenin faced the worsening of his health, the political landscape within the Communist Party began to shift rapidly. Two names emerged as the main contenders for leadership of the Soviet Union: Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. Stalin, then General Secretary of the party, was quietly accumulating administrative power and influence over the bureaucratic apparatus. Trotsky, People's Commissar for Military Affairs and a central figure at the Russian Revolution, was viewed as the leading theorist and orator in the Bolshevik movement. The rivalry between them had already begun in Lenin's final months, but intensified after his complete withdrawal. Trotsky held great prestige among revolutionaries and international recognition, but many saw him as arrogant and aloof. Stalin, on the other hand, built discreet alliances with other party leaders, such as Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, forming a triumvirate aimed at politically isolating Trotsky from the party's core decisions. This strategic alliance was key to solidifying Stalin's position within the Central Committee. One of the first actions of this alliance was controlling the disclosure of Lenin's political testament. Despite its critical content regarding Stalin, Zinoviev and Kamenev argued that publishing the document would cause instability within the party. As a result, the text was kept confidential during the 1924 Congress, preventing Lenin's recommendation to remove Stalin from even being publicly discussed. Although Trotsky was aware of the document's existence, he did not confront the others at the time, a move later viewed as a strategic mistake. Stalin, using his position as general secretary, began appointing allies to key positions in both regional and national party structures. He controlled the party machinery, admissions, promotions, and expulsions of members. This growing influence allowed him to shape the party's direction without having Trotsky's public visibility. At the same time, he positioned himself as the legitimate heir to Lenin's legacy, emphasizing his loyalty to the revolutionary leader and his practical role in building the Soviet state. Trotsky, meanwhile, took a more critical stance. He denounced the party's bureaucratization, internal repression, and the abandonment of the original ideals of the October Revolution. His views, however, met resistance in a political environment increasingly dominated by Stalin's allies. When he tried to organize opposition within the party, he was accused of factionalism and politically isolated. Despite his undeniable revolutionary credentials, Trotsky began to lose ground within the power structure. The year 1924 marked Lenin's official death and the beginning of the cult surrounding his image. Stalin was one of the main organizers of the funeral and embalming of Lenin's body, which was placed on public display in the Red Square Mausoleum. He used the occasion to symbolically associate himself with the founder of the revolution, reinforcing his authority among the masses and the party ranks. Meanwhile, Trotsky, sidelined due to health issues, did not attend the ceremony, a fact his opponents used to portray him as disrespectful or indifferent. The dispute between Stalin and Trotsky was not merely personal. It reflected fundamentally different visions for the future of the USSR. Trotsky defended permanent revolution and the international spread of socialism. Stalin, in contrast, promoted the idea of socialism in one country, focusing on the internal consolidation of the Soviet Union before any ideological expansion. This strategic divide would become the central issue in future conflicts, but by 1924, the balance of power had already tilted decisively in Stalin's favor. Lenin's succession was effectively underway.
Vladimir Lenin died on January 21, 1924, at 6:50 p.m. in Gorky, a residence near Moscow where he spent his final days weakened by successive strokes. He was only 53 years old, and his death was met with shock and deep sorrow across the Soviet Union. Newspapers quickly released special editions praising him as the architect of the October Revolution and the founder of the first socialist state in the world. The news spread rapidly to all regions of the country, prompting spontaneous expressions of mourning. Workers halted factory activities, soldiers saluted in silence, and radios played funeral music. Even critics of the regime acknowledged the historical importance of his figure. For the people, Lenin was more than a political leader. He was a symbol of revolutionary hope. His death left a void that no one knew how to fill. Lenin's body was brought to Moscow and placed on display at the House of the Unions, where thousands of people formed enormous lines to pay their final respects. In the harsh winter, crowds waited for hours in freezing temperatures to see the revolutionary leader one last time. Men, women, children, and soldiers passed silently before the coffin, often crying or saluting him. It was a collective ritual of grief that was quickly transformed into a political ceremony carefully organized by the Communist Party. As Soviets said their goodbyes, the Central Committee members mobilized to elevate Lenin's image to a near-sacred level. Posters with his idealized face were printed and distributed throughout the Soviet territory. The funeral was being turned into a national unification event. Popular emotion, spontaneous in many ways, was channeled to strengthen the regime. A few days after his death, the party made an unprecedented decision. Lenin's body would be embalmed and displayed permanently. This choice was controversial among some government officials, but it was soon accepted as a political strategy.
The goal was to make his symbolic presence eternal, even after his physical demise. On January 27, 1924, his body was transferred to a temporary wooden mausoleum in Red Square, Moscow. Later, this would be replaced by a permanent stone structure, becoming a site of civic pilgrimage for all Soviet citizens. The embalming process was handled by Soviet scientists who developed experimental techniques to preserve the body for decades. The public display was not merely an act of reverence, it was an ideological tool. Lenin was no longer just a revolutionary leader. He became part of the visual landscape of Soviet power. His death marked the birth of a cult. The official funeral ceremony gathered the main Communist Party leaders and was broadcast across the country. Joseph Stalin, who was already maneuvering behind the scenes for power, stood prominently during the ceremonies, delivering a speech on behalf of the Bolshevik leadership. Other figures such as Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin also paid public tributes, hailing Lenin as the father of the revolution and conscience of the world proletariat. Absent from the ceremony, Leon Trotsky was undergoing medical treatment in the Caucasus and failed to return in time, which was used by his rivals to weaken his public image. Letters and telegrams of condolence arrived from various countries, including workers and communist organizations in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The world watched closely as the Lenin era came to a close. Inside the USSR, the funeral became a carefully staged piece of propaganda. Every gesture was meant to preserve party unity and to elevate Stalin. After the symbolic burial, a campaign of renaming places in Lenin's honor began. Cities, streets, factories, schools, and even newborn children were named after the revolutionary leader. The city of Petrograd was renamed Leningrad. The party invested heavily in creating an eternal Lenin, associating his image with the revolution's success and the regime's legitimacy. School books included his quotes and speeches. Monuments were erected in all Soviet republics, from Siberia to Ukraine. His image was printed on coins, stamps, posters, and books. This marked the beginning of a personality cult that, while more moderate than Stalin's, already revealed the symbolic power the Soviet state would assign to its leaders. Lenin, now deceased, was being used as an ideological shield. His presence became mandatory in all spheres of public life. Despite the grandeur of the tributes, many Soviets experienced a quiet, genuine grief. For older citizens, Lenin's death represented the end of a revolutionary ideal that had promised a different future. For the youth, he was the hero who toppled the czars and confronted the bourgeois world with courage and intellect. Even critics of the authoritarian aspects of the regime acknowledged his historical impact. Amid collective mourning, there was also uncertainty. No one knew exactly what the USSR would be without Lenin. Could revolutionary ideals survive without his presence? Tension quietly settled behind the scenes. As his body rested in the mausoleum, political games began to intensify. Lenin's succession was now open, and every gesture during his funeral carried the weight of the future. Lenin's death, therefore, did not end his influence. It amplified it. With his body exposed in the heart of the Soviet Union, he became an omnipresent symbol of Soviet socialism. His words would be cited for decades to justify state decisions. His image, carefully crafted by the party, would be used both to inspire and to control. But political reality would gradually drift away from his original teachings. Leninism began to turn into dogma, interpreted, manipulated, and adapted by those who competed for power in his name. While the people revered his legacy, the party began to reshape it according to ideological convenience. Lenin had died, but his shadow would loom over the entire Soviet history still to come.
On January 21, 1924, Vladimir Lenin died in Gorky, on the outskirts of Moscow, after years of declining health caused by consecutive strokes. He was partially paralyzed, unable to speak, and completely removed from politics since 1923. His death was officially announced by the Soviet government with great emotion. Thousands of citizens braved the harsh winter to pay their respects to the revolutionary leader. His body was embalmed and displayed in the Kremlin before being placed in a hastily built mausoleum in Red Square. The line to see him stretched for miles, demonstrating the cult around the man who shaped the new Russia. Even while ill and absent, he was still seen as the ultimate symbol of the October Revolution. With his death, the Soviet Union plunged into a leadership vacuum. Lenin had not designated a successor, and the strongest names, especially Trotsky and Stalin, were already competing behind the scenes. Lenin's testament, a document in which he criticized several party members, including Stalin, was suppressed by the Bolsheviks to avoid instability. Trotsky, sick, did not attend the funeral, a fact politically exploited by Stalin and his allies. Trotsky's symbolic absence helped cement Stalin's image as the party's central figure. Thus, Lenin's final wishes were ignored, and the power struggle accelerated. The transition was not peaceful, it was silent, strategic, and ruthless. Internally, the party moved quickly to canonize Lenin as a sacred figure. His image began to appear in schools, public offices, and ideological manuals. The term Marxism-Leninism was adopted as the state's official doctrine. Statues were erected throughout Soviet territory, transforming Lenin into a myth present on every corner. The Red Square Mausoleum became a mandatory pilgrimage site. But while his image was immortalized, his ideas began to be reinterpreted. The reformist Lenin, who criticized bureaucracy, was silenced, while the ruthless Lenin of the Civil War was exalted. The myth grew, drifting further and further from the real man. Outside the USSR, Lenin's death was observed with both caution and interest. In the West, hopes arose that his absence might open room for moderate reforms or even the regime's collapse. In countries sympathetic to socialism, his death caused mourning and uncertainty about the direction of the revolution. Revolutionaries in Germany, France, and Latin America cited Lenin as a model, but feared that Bolshevism might lose its character under new leadership. His theoretical legacy began to be disputed worldwide. He was too powerful a symbol to be forgotten, and at the same time, an easy name to manipulate according to each group's interests. Lenin no longer belonged to himself. In his final years, Lenin had expressed concern about the direction the revolution was taking. He criticized the growing bureaucracy, the authoritarianism of certain party members, and blind repression. His letters revealed a man frustrated with what the Soviet state was becoming. He still believed in building socialism, but feared the means were corrupting the ends. This view found no room after his death. The new leadership needed an infallible Lenin, not a critical one. The more human and contradictory aspects of his personality were erased from official records. What remained was the hero, simplified, hardened, carved in marble. As years passed, the cult of Lenin's image intensified, even as his real thinking was increasingly set aside. His writings became mandatory manuals, his portraits illustrated school books, his signature became a state logo. But his ideas about decentralization, workers' democracy, and pluralism were abandoned in the name of efficiency and control. The Soviet state moved toward a model Lenin had started to criticize, but had no time to fight. The man who transformed global politics in just a few years was becoming a living statue. His presence was constant, but his voice had already been silenced. Thus ended the journey of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known worldwide as Lenin. From radical young student to political exile, from clandestine conspirator to revolutionary leader, from head of state to mythological figure. His impact on the 20th century was undeniable. He created a new model of power, redefined the relationship between masses and government, and ushered in an era of revolutions and ideological polarization. His death was not just the end of a life, it was the end of an era. The communist world would continue its course, but without the man who had given it origin, and the void left by Lenin would be filled, not by continuity, but by something new.
Lenin's death marked not only the end of a man's life, but the close of an era of idealistic revolution that would soon give way to an even harsher regime under Stalin. His writings, strategies, and decisions echoed for decades, influencing revolutions, governments, and wars across continents. Despite the image built over the years, Lenin was a profoundly contradictory figure, a defender of equality, yet willing to embrace authoritarianism when he deemed it necessary. His legacy remains one of the most complex in modern history, dividing interpretations and sparking debate to this day. To understand Lenin is to understand part of the architecture of the 20th century. His journey was not just that of a revolutionary leader, but of a man shaped by personal loss, unshakable ideals, and decisions that changed the world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to keep following along.